The morning started like any other, but something felt off, like the universe was whispering a secret just out of reach and I couldn't quite catch it. The smell of fresh coffee filled the kitchen, warm and familiar, yet my heart pounded with an unfamiliar weight. I reached up for the sugar jar on the top shelf, and that's when I saw it. My wedding ring, carelessly left on the edge of the wooden shelf, glinting in the soft morning light. My breath caught in my throat. I never took it off. Never. I slid it back onto my finger, the metal cold and tight, almost foreign, like it didn't belong to me anymore. I forced myself to breathe as I turned toward the window, watching the soft drizzle patter against the glass, and felt a strange emptiness settle deep in my chest. His footsteps echoed in the hallway, sharp and steady, the sound of routine and responsibility, and I knew what came next. He walked into the kitchen without looking up from his phone, adjusting his tie with a practiced motion that spoke of repetition and comfort, not affection. His voice was clipped, distracted, more focused on the screen than on me. "Hey, Scott's coming over tonight," he said, his tone businesslike, as though we were colleagues, not husband and wife. The name hit me like a spark on dry grass. Scott. His friend. His colleague. And the man whose eyes lingered a little too long when we accidentally crossed paths weeks ago in that crowded bookstore downtown, where the scent of old paper and fresh ink hung heavy in the air, and his smile sent a flicker of something dangerous down my spine. I nodded, trying to keep my expression neutral, but inside a storm was brewing. The day crawled by with agonizing slowness. I busied myself with chores, wiping down counters that didn't need cleaning, organizing drawers already neat, folding laundry with mechanical precision, all to silence the nervous energy buzzing beneath my skin. Evening came like a slow wave, bringing with it both dread and anticipation. I set the table carefully, smoothing the linen napkins, adjusting the silverware, pouring wine I wouldn't drink. The doorbell rang and my breath hitched. He stepped inside, tall and composed, wearing that easy smile that masked something deeper, something electric. His eyes met mine for a second longer than polite, and my heart skipped. Conversation flowed effortlessly between him and my husband, laughter echoing off the kitchen walls, but every glance, every accidental brush of his hand near mine felt loaded with unspoken words. During dinner, his knee brushed against mine under the table, just a fleeting contact, but it sent a shiver up my spine so sharp I had to grip my wine glass tighter to steady my hand. I stole glances when I thought no one noticed, but I caught him doing the same, his eyes dark, unreadable, yet telling me everything I was trying not to hear. As the evening wound down, plates cleared, candles flickering low, my husband excused himself to take a work call in the other room, and silence filled the space between us like thick fog. He leaned in just slightly, his voice low, smooth as honey, whispering, "We'll see each other again." I could only nod, unable to trust my voice. At the door he turned to leave, his coat draped over his arm, his smile soft but knowing. I reached out to hand him the umbrella he'd left by the door, and in that small moment our fingers touched. Just skin on skin, but my entire body reacted like a struck match. I froze, breath shallow, heart hammering loud in my ears, and he hesitated just long enough for me to know it wasn't accidental. He stepped out into the night, the door clicking shut behind him, leaving me standing there, palms damp, knees weak, staring at the handle as though it might turn again. I was left alone in the quiet, surrounded by the echoes of polite conversation and the ghost of his touch, knowing that line had been drawn, and I had no idea if I'd step over it, or if I already had. The next morning I woke up determined to erase the night before from my mind, clinging to routine like a lifeline, desperate to drown out the hum of something dangerous growing under my skin. So I scrubbed the kitchen until my hands felt raw and rearranged the spice rack 3 times, though it was already perfect, each motion mechanical and hollow, but still the memory of his eyes lingered at the edges of my thoughts like a whisper I couldn't silence. So I called Lisa, my oldest friend, someone who talked too much and asked too few questions, perfect for distraction, and we met at the cafe on Main where she rambled about her neighbor's new car and her daughter's engagement while I nodded and smiled, pretending to care, stirring my coffee so aggressively the spoon clinked against the cup like a nervous tick. But still I saw his face in every passerby, every glance over a shoulder, feeling like him, watching, waiting, testing my resolve, and when Lisa finally hugged me goodbye with her usual too tight squeeze, I told myself I was fine, normal, steady, and drove straight to the mall, telling myself I needed new sheets but really just needing noise, crowds, life swirling around me to drown out the silence in my head. and I wandered the aisles aimlessly, running my fingers over fabric swatches and unnecessary kitchen gadgets, trying to fill a void that only seemed to grow. And then I turned a corner and froze because there he was, standing by the checkout line holding a small bag, wearing that same calm, confident expression that made my heart trip over itself. And before I could move or turn away, his eyes met mine and the air shifted, heavy and charged, and he smiled just enough to make my breath catch, taking a step closer, and I felt my pulse thudding in my neck as he gently handed me a paper bag I hadn't even noticed I'd dropped, his fingers grazing mine so lightly it was almost nothing, but everything at once, and he murmured a soft "hi" that wrapped around me like silk, sending a shiver down my back, and all I could do was nod, clutching the bag like a lifeline and forcing myself to walk away on legs that felt like jelly, each step echoing with regret and relief all tangled together. And when I finally made it back to the car, I sat in the driver's seat with the engine off, heart racing, palms damp, replaying that brief touch over and over until I couldn't breathe. But home offered no refuge because the moment I walked in, the cold weight of reality settled on my shoulders, the house silent except for the faint hum of the dishwasher, and he sat on the couch, laptop open, tie loosened, eyes tired, the lines on his forehead deeper than I remembered, and when he looked up, there was no warmth, only exhaustion and distraction, his words clipped as he muttered about work stress and deadlines and a boss who didn't understand, and I nodded and listened, but all I could think about was how far we'd drifted without even noticing. And after dinner, eaten in silence broken only by the clink of forks on plates, I retreated to the bedroom, scrolling mindlessly through emails, craving escape, when the screen lit up with a new message and my breath caught as I read the words. Today's coincidence wasn't a coincidence, and I stared at those 8 words, heart pounding, fingers trembling over the keyboard, debating whether to delete, reply, or throw my phone across the room, but instead I just sat there, screen glowing in the darkness, knowing I wouldn't answer, but also knowing I couldn't stop thinking about him, not now, not anymore. The house felt too small, the walls pressing in with every breath, suffocating under the weight of things unsaid and emotions I couldn't name, so I grabbed my jacket and slipped out the door, telling myself I just needed air, a walk, time to clear my head, though deep down I knew I was running from something I couldn't face, and my feet carried me to the park without conscious thought, the familiar crunch of gravel under my shoes oddly soothing as I followed the winding path toward the pond, where ducks drifted lazily, the surface of the water calm and undisturbed, unlike the storm inside me. And as I rounded the bend, I saw him standing by the bench under the old oak tree, hands in his pockets, gaze distant, and for a moment I thought about turning back, slipping away unnoticed, but he turned at that exact second and our eyes met, freezing me in place like a deer caught in headlights, and he smiled, slow and warm, a smile that reached his eyes and tugged at something deep inside me I hadn't felt in years, and he said, "Fancy meeting you here," his voice soft and teasing, and I laughed before I could stop myself, the sound awkward and breathless, but he didn't seem to mind, falling into step beside me as though we did this all the time, 2 old friends out for a stroll, and we walked along the water's edge, the quiet between us comfortable, punctuated only by the distant laughter of children and the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. And after a while he asked about my favorite books, and I told him about the ones I loved but rarely had time to read anymore, and he confessed he read late at night when sleep wouldn't come, losing himself in stories because sometimes pretending to be someone else was easier than facing who you really were, and I understood that more than I cared to admit, and I found myself telling him things I hadn't shared with anyone in years. How exhausting it was to always play the perfect wife, the dependable partner, the one who kept everything running while quietly crumbling inside, and he listened without judgment, his eyes kind and steady, making me feel seen in a way I didn't know I craved, and the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, and I knew I should go, but I didn't want the moment to end, didn't want to return to the cold, quiet house and the weight of routine pressing down on my chest, so we lingered at the edge of the path, facing each other, the air between us thick with something unspoken, and he reached out slowly, brushing a loose strand of hair from my face, his fingertips grazing my cheek so lightly I shivered, and for a heartbeat we just stood there, eyes locked, breath caught, and then without thinking, without planning, I leaned in and pressed my lips to his, soft and tentative, tasting warmth and possibility and danger all at once, and it was brief, just a whisper of a kiss, but it ignited something deep inside me, something wild and terrifying and exhilarating. And the moment our lips parted I realized there was no going back, no pretending this hadn't happened, and panic surged through me, hot and overwhelming, and before he could say a word I turned and bolted, heart racing, breath ragged, running through the fading light, leaves crunching beneath my feet as I fled from him, from myself, from the terrifying truth that I had crossed a line and nothing would ever be the same again. The next morning, the weight of what I'd done settled over me like a heavy fog, suffocating and relentless, and I knew I couldn't let it happen again, couldn't allow that fire to consume the parts of me that still clung to order and reason. So I grabbed my phone with trembling hands and blocked his number, the confirmation screen flashing cold and final. But the relief I expected didn't come, just a hollow ache that gnawed at me with every passing minute. So I threw myself into work answering emails with mechanical precision, crossing off tasks from my to-do list like a machine desperate for distraction, every chore a temporary bandage over a wound that refused to close. And when the afternoon light faded, I forced myself into the kitchen, rolling up my sleeves, determined to play the part I'd rehearsed for years, the dutiful wife, the steady presence. And when he came home, tired and distracted, I greeted him with a smile that felt foreign on my face, asking about his day while chopping vegetables with forced cheer, the blade hitting the cutting board in steady hollow rhythm, and we cooked together, standing side by side like two actors in a play we no longer believed in, stirring pots and setting the table, going through motions so well practiced they needed no thought. But the air between us felt tight, stretched thin by everything unsaid, and every time his hand brushed mine, I flinched just slightly, guilt pooling hot and bitter in my chest. And during dinner, the silence between bites was deafening, broken only by the clinking of silverware and the occasional shallow comment about work or bills or weekend plans that neither of us truly cared about. And I found myself watching him, really looking at him, noticing the lines on his face, the tired slump of his shoulders, and realizing with a cold clarity that I felt nothing beyond habit, beyond the comfort of routine that had long since replaced affection. And that thought scared me more than anything. Because I couldn't remember when the shift had happened, when duty had quietly taken the place of desire, and after we cleaned up, he retreated to the living room with his laptop while I sat at the kitchen table, staring at my untouched cup of tea, the minutes dragging by heavy and suffocating, until a text from Lisa popped up on my screen, her bubbly invitation to an art exhibit downtown reading like a lifeline, and I agreed without hesitation, needing air, noise, anything but this suffocating stillness. And the gallery was bright and crowded, full of people speaking in low, thoughtful tones as they admired brushstrokes and color palettes. But all I could do was move through the space like a ghost, my mind elsewhere, my heart pounding with nerves I couldn't explain until I turned a corner and froze. Because there he was, standing across the room, his eyes meeting mine with the force of a tidal wave, and for a long moment the world narrowed to just the space between us, charged and breathless, and neither of us spoke, not a word, just that electric connection that made the air crackle, until he gave the faintest nod and turned away, disappearing into the crowd, leaving me standing there trembling, my pulse racing and my resolve crumbling. And that night I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, torn between the weight of duty and the pull of temptation, my thoughts spinning in circles, exhaustion tugging at me but sleep refusing to come. And every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, felt his touch, heard his breath mingling with mine, and I knew no matter how hard I tried to bury it, part of me didn't want to let go. He came home early that evening, arms full of grocery bags and a determined look on his face, and for a moment I blinked, startled, watching as he unpacked wine, candles, and ingredients I hadn't seen him choose in years. And he smiled, awkward but genuine, telling me he thought we could use a night just for ourselves, away from stress, away from the noise. And I nodded, my heart tight with guilt and gratitude tangled into something I couldn't untangle. And he moved around the kitchen with focused purpose, chopping, stirring, humming softly to a tune that felt familiar but distant, something from years ago when we still held hands without thinking, when silence was comfortable instead of heavy. And I sat at the counter watching, trying to push away the weight in my chest, trying to remind myself that this was good, that he was good, that this was everything I should want. And when dinner was ready, he lit the candles, dimmed the lights, and old music crackled through the speakers, Sinatra's voice filling the room with warmth and nostalgia. And he reached into his pocket, pulling out a small velvet box, handing it to me with a soft smile that made my stomach twist. And inside was a delicate silver bracelet, simple but thoughtful, engraved with our anniversary date. And I blinked back tears that weren't joy, whispering thank you as he clasped it around my wrist, his fingers lingering just a second too long. And he raised his glass, toasting to us, to all we'd built. And I clinked mine against his, the sound sharp and clear. And I sipped the wine, its warmth doing nothing to settle the chill inside me. And after dinner he took my hand, leading me to the living room, pulling me gently into a slow dance, his breath warm against my temple, his arms solid and steady, and I closed my eyes, willing myself to feel, to remember what it was like to belong fully to this man, to this life. But all I could see behind my eyelids was another face, another touch, another moment that had no place here. And when he tipped my chin up and kissed me, soft and tender, I kissed him back, lips moving against his, but empty, mechanical, a rehearsed gesture lacking spark. And in that moment I realized with piercing clarity that I was imagining someone else. Another mouth, another taste, and shame burned hot in my chest. But I couldn't stop it, couldn't control the way my mind betrayed me. And when the kiss ended, he smiled softly, oblivious, pressing his forehead to mine in a gesture so familiar it felt foreign. And we sat together on the couch afterward, his head resting on my shoulder, the weight of his presence both comforting and suffocating. And later, when we climbed into bed, his breathing even and steady beside me, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, my mind racing, guilt gnawing at me with relentless persistence. And every breath he took felt like a reminder of the life I was supposed to want, the life I had promised to nurture and protect. But all I could feel was the hollow echo of absence where love should have been, and I closed my eyes tightly, trying to block out the image of someone else's hands on me, someone else's voice whispering my name. But the harder I tried to suppress it, the clearer it became, until it was all I could see. And I turned onto my side, staring at the wall, listening to the rhythm of his breathing, steady and unaware, while my own chest felt tight and restless. And I knew that no matter how hard I fought, no matter how deeply I buried the truth, I couldn't unfeel what I felt, couldn't undo what had already been set in motion. And the darkness stretched endlessly around me, silent witness to a battle I was already losing. The ballroom was loud, filled with the hum of overlapping conversations, clinking glasses, forced laughter, and the hollow sound of small talk bouncing off polished marble floors. And I told myself I belonged here, standing near the long white draped table piled with hors d'oeuvres and carefully arranged fruit platters, sipping sparkling water I barely tasted, nodding politely at familiar faces, pretending to listen to discussions about quarterly results and industry forecasts. But my pulse thudded in my ears, out of rhythm with the carefully staged ease around me. And then I felt it before I saw him, that subtle shift in the air like a static charge before a summer storm. And I turned slowly, scanning the room crowded with suits and evening dresses. And there he was, across the room, standing near the tall glass doors leading out to the terrace, his hand resting casually in his pocket, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth as his eyes locked onto mine. And in that instant the noise around me faded into a dull blur, leaving only the electric pull between us tightening like a wire drawn too tight, ready to snap. And he moved first, weaving through the clusters of people with effortless confidence, stopping just close enough that I could smell the faint spice of his cologne, warm and clean and far too familiar. And he leaned in as though commenting on the food, his voice low and steady, but his words not meant for anyone else's ears as he murmured, "We shouldn't be doing this." And his hand brushed against mine, a touch so light it could have been accidental but wasn't. And my breath caught, heart pounding too hard as I nodded, not trusting my voice. And his fingers found mine, curling gently around them, hidden between the folds of the tablecloth where no one could see. And for a moment we just stood there, pretending to study the cheese board, his thumb brushing slow, dangerous circles over the back of my hand. And it felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, staring down at the waves crashing far below, terrified and exhilarated all at once. And I knew I should pull away, step back, disappear into the safety of the crowd, but I couldn't. My hand stayed in his, warm and steady, and he whispered again, softer this time, almost pleading, "We can't." And I barely managed to whisper back, "I know." But neither of us moved, frozen in that fragile moment of reckless closeness, the world around us oblivious. And then someone called his name, breaking the spell, and he stepped back, releasing my hand with a final brush of fingertips that left my skin tingling. And the rest of the night passed in a haze of conversations I couldn't follow, forced smiles that felt brittle and insincere, all the while feeling his presence somewhere nearby, always just out of reach. And when I finally escaped to the restroom, my phone buzzed in my clutch with a new notification, and my stomach dropped as I opened the company group chat to find a photo someone had taken. A wide shot of the buffet line, laughter frozen in candid smiles, and there we were, too close, his gaze on me, my body angled toward him in a way that told more truth than words ever could. And my breath caught, panic rising as I read the playful caption beneath the image. "Power meeting or something more?" followed by a string of winking emojis, and I knew it was meant as a harmless joke, but my hands trembled anyway, my pulse racing as if the secret we tried to contain had spilled into the open, not fully exposed but dangerously close, and I put the phone down, forcing myself to breathe, but the tension coiled tight in my chest told me this wasn't over, not even close. The message came early in the morning, simple and harmless on the surface, just an invitation for coffee, nothing more, just two adults talking, and I stared at the screen for a full minute, debating, my heart pounding faster with every second, knowing I should ignore it, knowing I should delete it and move on, but my fingers betrayed me, typing back a hesitant yes before my brain could catch up, and all day I moved through routines like a shadow, folding laundry, answering emails, nodding through conversations, but my thoughts were already at that cafe on the corner, the one with the old brick walls and creaky chairs where no one paid attention to anything but their own conversations, and when I walked in he was already there, sitting by the window with 2 cups of coffee, his smile soft and disarming, and for a moment it felt innocent, like catching up with an old friend, safe and controlled, and I sat down, fingers curling around the warm ceramic mug, breathing in the scent of roasted beans and cinnamon, and we talked first about nothing. Weather, work, weekend plans, and then about deeper things, about feeling trapped in lives that looked perfect on the outside but felt hollow underneath, about the weight of expectations and the exhaustion of constantly performing, and he listened in a way that made me feel weightless, understood in ways I didn't realize I was starving for, and when we stood up to leave, the air between us had shifted, thicker, heavier, electric with unspoken things, and outside the cafe the afternoon light was soft, the street quiet, and he motioned toward the side parking lot behind the building, saying he'd parked there, and I followed without thinking, every step louder in my head than the last, my breath shallow, nerves sparking just under my skin, and in that small, shadowed space, the conversation faltered, replaced by silence so dense it felt physical, pressing us closer, and then it happened. His hand brushed mine, and the contact was electric, sending a jolt through my chest, and before I could think or speak, his arms were around me, pulling me in, and I didn't resist, couldn't resist, my body moving on instinct, melting into his warmth, his lips finding mine with a hunger that burned away every ounce of hesitation, and for a long, reckless moment, the world vanished, replaced by the taste of him, the feel of his breath mingling with mine, the press of his chest against me, and then a voice cut through the fog like ice water, smooth and laced with amusement. Well, good evening, and we froze, tearing apart, turning to see Mark, a mutual acquaintance from work, standing a few feet away with a knowing smirk and raised eyebrows, his tone light but edged with something sharp, and he nodded politely, his eyes dancing with unspoken laughter as he continued on his way, leaving silence and panic in his wake, and my heart plummeted, my hands shaking as I realized what had just happened, what had been witnessed, and the weight of it crashed down all at once, suffocating and undeniable, and I turned, mumbling a rushed goodbye, stumbling toward my car with trembling fingers fumbling for the door handle, breath hitching, chest tight, and the drive home was a blur of headlights and pounding heartbeats, my mind replaying the moment on loop, dread twisting in my stomach, and when I finally pulled into the driveway, my hands were still shaking, my whole body trembling with adrenaline and regret, and I sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, staring at the house, knowing I couldn't undo what was done, knowing control had shattered and everything was about to unravel. The house was quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that felt heavy and suffocating, and I sat on the couch with my legs tucked under me, scrolling mindlessly through messages, heart still racing from the events of the day, the taste of his lips lingering on mine like a secret I couldn't spit out, and my phone buzzed, the screen lighting up with his name, and I hesitated, knowing I shouldn't open it. But curiosity burned stronger than caution, and I tapped the notification, breath catching as the words appeared, "I miss your taste," simple, raw, reckless, and I froze, staring at the screen, fingers trembling, panic rising fast and hot in my chest, and before I could even process what to do, I heard the front door creak open, footsteps echoing down the hall, and my heart stopped cold as my husband's voice called out, light and casual, "Hey, I'm home," earlier than expected, unplanned and terrifying. And I scrambled to lock my phone, shoving it face down on the cushion, but his footsteps were already too close, and he stepped into the room with a tired smile, loosening his tie, eyes soft from a long day, and then they shifted, narrowing slightly as they landed on the phone between us, the screen lighting up again with the same message, bold and unforgiving, and he looked at me, his expression still calm but darker now, heavier, and he asked, in a voice so quiet it cut deeper than any shout, "What's that?" Just those 2 words, but they hit like a punch to the ribs. And I panicked, grabbing the phone, swiping the message away with shaking hands, deleting it as if that could erase the damage. But the look in his eyes told me it was too late. The silence stretching long and suffocating between us, and I opened my mouth to speak, to explain, to lie, but nothing came out, my throat closing tight around the words that wouldn't save me anyway. And he didn't raise his voice, didn't accuse or demand. He just stood there, his face blank, his eyes distant, and that emptiness was so much worse than anger, so much colder. And he turned without another word, walking slowly down the hallway, his steps heavy and deliberate, and the door to the bedroom closed softly behind him with a finality that made my stomach twist painfully. And I sat frozen on the couch, breath shallow, heart pounding so loud it drowned out every sound, and the weight of what had just happened pressed down on me until I couldn't move, couldn't think, only feel the crushing certainty that everything was breaking apart, and the minutes dragged by in suffocating silence, the air thick and still, and eventually I forced myself to stand, legs weak and trembling, and I crept down the hallway, pressing my ear to the bedroom door. But there was nothing, no movement, no sound, just silence so heavy it felt like a wall between us, and I went back to the couch, curling into myself, staring at the blank television screen, replaying every mistake in vivid detail, every touch, every look, every word that had led to this moment. And the house felt colder than it ever had, the walls closing in, the air too thin, and I sat there until the clock on the mantel ticked past midnight, the silence growing thicker with every passing second, and I knew he was awake in there, lying in the dark, staring at the ceiling just like I was. And that night stretched on endlessly, filled with nothing but the weight of betrayal and the crushing knowledge that the life I had built, the life I had clung to, was crumbling beneath me, and there was no taking it back. The morning came cold and hollow, the kind of silence that presses against your chest until you can barely breathe, and I heard him moving in the hallway, quiet and methodical, the sounds of zippers closing and shoes being tied, all without a word, and I stayed in bed with my eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling, hoping, begging silently that he would come in, say something, anything, even if it was anger or blame. But the door never opened, only the distant echo of his footsteps down the stairs, the soft creak of the front door, and then the sound of his car starting, the engine rumbling low and steady, fading down the street until there was nothing but silence, heavy and suffocating, and I sat up slowly, the emptiness of the house swallowing me whole, each room suddenly too big, too quiet, every tick of the clock loud and cruel, and I picked up my phone with shaking hands, dialing his number before I could talk myself out of it, pressing the phone to my ear, heart pounding, each ring like a hammer against my ribs, but it went to voicemail, his recorded voice calm, distant, and I hung up quickly, biting my lip, trying not to cry, and I called again, desperate, fingers trembling, but he didn't answer, and I knew he wouldn't, not now, maybe not ever, and the weight of that realization was heavier than I could bear, so I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at nothing, and opened my messages, scrolling to the one thread I swore I wouldn't touch but couldn't leave alone, and I typed the words slowly, each letter burning into my screen, my heart breaking with every tap. It's over. Please don't look for me. And I hit send before I could stop myself, my breath coming short and shaky, and seconds later his reply came through, simple and sharp as a blade. I never looked. You found me. And those 6 words hit harder than I ever thought possible, the weight of the truth folding over me like a wave, and I dropped the phone, letting it fall to the floor with a soft thud, curling up on the bed, my body trembling, my chest tight, and for the first time it hit me with brutal clarity. Neither of them was mine anymore, not the man I built a life with, not the one I risked it all for, both slipping through my fingers like sand, leaving nothing but empty sheets and silence, and I buried my face in the pillow, tears hot and relentless, knowing that I was alone in this house, in this moment, in this life I had broken with my own hands, and the emptiness felt endless, the days stretched out in heavy silence, each one blending into the next, marked only by the sound of the clock ticking on the wall and the distant hum of cars passing outside, and I moved through the house like a ghost, opening curtains in the morning only to close them again in the afternoon. Cooking meals I barely touched, cleaning spotless countertops just to feel busy, to avoid thinking, but the emptiness clung to me like a second skin, and the house felt colder with each passing hour, the walls echoing with memories I no longer trusted, and the nights were the worst, lying in bed listening to the creaks of the house settling, the soft rustle of leaves outside the window, and the relentless voice in my head reminding me that I had done this, that no one else had made these choices but me. And on the 3rd morning I found the envelope on the kitchen table, his handwriting neat and familiar, and I hesitated before opening it, heart pounding so loudly I could hear it in my ears, and the words were simple, final, sharp as broken glass. I can't forgive, but I can't stay either. Good luck. And I sat down, the paper shaking in my hands, the weight of those few lines crushing me in a way no shouted argument ever could. And I folded it carefully, placing it back on the table like it might shatter if I touched it again. And hours later, another envelope arrived, slid under the door in silence, and I knew before opening it who it was from, and his words were softer but just as heavy. If you ever just want to talk, I'll be here. But nothing more, and I read those words over and over, each time feeling the door close a little tighter, the air get a little thinner, and the truth settled in deep and cold. Neither of them belonged to me anymore, not the man I had built years of memories with, not the man who had made me feel alive for a fleeting, dangerous moment. And now there was nothing left but echoes and regrets, and I made myself a cup of tea, pouring the hot water slowly, watching the steam curl up like ghosts of choices I couldn't take back, and I sat at the kitchen table, staring out the window at the gray autumn rain falling steady and relentless, drops streaking down the glass like tears I couldn't cry anymore. And the apartment felt cavernous, every tick of the clock louder than the last, and I looked at the half-empty cup in front of me, the tea already going cold, untouched and forgotten, and I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, feeling the weight settle deep in my bones, and in that moment there was no anger, no hope, just the quiet certainty that I had made my choice, and in doing so, I had lost both of them, and maybe worse, I had lost myself. And I sat there as the rain kept falling, whispering against the windows, soft and steady, and the silence wrapped around me like a blanket I couldn't shake off, and all I could think over and over was that I had crossed a line I could never uncross, and now all that remained was emptiness, heavy and endless.